I've had quite a few requests for some brake videos. So today we're going to work on a basic service of the front brake caliper. This also includes replacing the brake pads if that's what you want to do. But very often with these calipers, what you actually need to do, especially if you live somewhere like the UK, is to keep them clean, because we get a lot of salt on the roads over winter. It builds up in the calipers and it causes corrosion problems. So it's good to give the calipers a clean every now and again. Let's get into this and pull that caliper apart. Before we talk about the front caliper, let's talk about the brake reservoir. Down here there's a minimum marking, and you might just be able to see there's a little bubble up there which tells you the top level of the fluid. Now this says the fluid is okay on my caliper, and that's what I would expect. When you've got relatively new brake pads in on the front caliper, that bubble should be up the top. As your pads wear down, that will move down, and that's completely normal. When it gets down towards the low, that's a good indication that your pads need to be changed. If your pads are good and your brake level is low, you have a problem. Probably a leak somewhere in your brake system, and you should fix that immediately. What you shouldn't do is go, oh, it's low, and top it up, because that doesn't fix the problem as to why it's low in the first place. You shouldn't need to top up your brake fluid at all unless you've worked on the brakes and you've somehow lost some brake fluid in the process, in which case, and it's fair enough. But you've also got to bear in mind that if you top up the brake fluid when your pads are half worn, when you push the brake pads back into the caliper, the system will overflow and the brake fluid will leak out the top. Even if you've got this cover still on, there are little air gaps around it to allow the air in and out of the reservoir, and the fluid will come out of those holes. This uses DOT 4, which is corrosive to paint, so it'll damage your paint. For this reason, anytime you take the top off, you want to get some rags and such around underneath this and around this to catch any spills. It will also take the paint off the reservoir, so be careful with that. If we're going to push the pistons back on the caliper, then we should take the top off of this so we can monitor what's happening. And it's just 2 screws on the top. Make sure you get a well-fitting screwdriver so you don't damage these screws. And I can see white corrosion in here, which is what you typically get with steel into an alloy caliper. And it's always a good idea to have some protection against any drips. Now, I've just taken the metal cover off. Underneath that, there's a plastic cover. What I would recommend when you take this off is that you don't turn it upside down. So now it's going to drip brake fluid. If you turn that upside down, then the fluid, you can see it's wet there, is going to drip into the top part, and that will cause it, when you put it back on, to drip all over your bike. Do this when this is upright as possible. I've got the bike slightly leant over for filming purposes. The fluid is actually at an angle, but just in here you can see a line. That line normally marks the top for the filling up of the fluid. So anytime we work on the caliper, we now need to keep an eye on this fluid, because if we push the pads back, it's going to push the fluid back through the system and into the reservoir. This looks about right for my bike, because I've got a little bit of wear on the pads, so it's pretty much up at the level it should be. I'm not going to top this up. It looks right for what I expect for the pad wear. This is a front brake caliper, and it's quite a good little unit. I know that some people replace them, but really, unless you're doing something extreme like racing or similar, I don't really see the need. This is a perfectly good unit for road use. I believe the Gen 1 bikes used a different pad, but as far as I'm aware, the Gen 2 use a sintered brake pad. And you could change it for a different sintered brake pad. I like EBC, for example, but I'm not convinced you're really going to get much difference in performance out of it. Now, I am using a different disc. I've got the it's a Galfer disc. It's effectively the Powerpart replacement disc, which allows more cooling. Now, to get this off, first thing is a little spring clip, and then we remove this pin. It's a T30. This is where you start to get corrosion, because this is a steel pin into an alloy caliper, which in the UK is a recipe for disaster. You can normally get replacements for these pins in other materials. Okay, now normally you have to take this spring clip out after you've taken the pin out. Now you should be able to wiggle the pads out. It's a Brembo pad, a Brembo sintered pad, so that really is as good as you're going to get. You can clean this up with brake fluid and such, but really about the only thing you want to do is just clean that groove out with the nice sintered pad. The wear limit on this is 1mm. As you can see, I've got loads of wear. It's a nice pad, no reason to change it. And same on the other side. Just give that groove a bit of a clean. You can clean around the pads if you want. Try not to breathe this dust in, it's not good for you. Try and keep them in the same orientation for when you put them back. This is really all there is to it. What we should do now is just get in there with some brake cleaner and maybe a brush if you've got something that will go in there, and just clean up all in there. If you want to clean this out better, and I would recommend it, just take these two bolts off and the whole caliper will then come away, and you can then lift it around and give it a proper clean. So if you've got a brush that will get in there, you can get in and clean it. I haven't really got a brush that's small enough, so my choice would normally be to take this off. These are loctited in place, so they should be a bit stiff to come out. And you should clean the threads up before putting them back in to clean out all the old loctite. And don't forget the spacers that sit on these fork legs. Now we can get in there much more easily and give that a good clean. It also gives us a chance to push these pistons back in if you want to fit new pads. So this is a nice little 4-pot caliper. It's a great entry-level caliper. I really don't see any issue with this for your average biking needs. We do need to clean it up, as I say. Get some brake clean on here, spray it in here, just get a brush or whatever and wipe it up. What we're looking to do is to actually get these nice and clean too. And they look coated, so try not to scratch them with a metal brush or anything, because that will lead them to corrode. And now we've got the brake disc out of the way. You really want a nylon brush. Just get in there and give it a good scrub. This caliper is so light, it's okay in my opinion just to let it hang from the brake hose. I don't think you're going to do it any damage. And then give it a good clean. Take your time. Try not to twist that brake hose too much. What you can do at this point is to very carefully operate the brake lever and to pump these pistons out a little bit more. That will allow you to get in there and clean them, but then you've got to get them back in. KTM recommend a pair of Stilsons, something like this, to get in here, perhaps a bigger set that I'm using, and protect the caliper and the pads with cloth, cardboard or whatever, and to actually push them back in with this. You can instead get various variations on these clamping devices which are designed for this application. You can put them inside there, and then you can spread those out and they will push the pistons back in the caliper. You need to do this if you're fitting new pads because your old pads are worn out, and that means that they will be sitting about here, so the pistons will be out and you won't be able to get the new pads in and onto the disc while the pistons are out, so you need to push them back. Remember, as you push these back in, you need to watch your reservoir and make sure it doesn't overflow. They don't have to go back in all the way, they just have to go back in far enough for you to be able to get this back on. So now I can put these back into place. If you prefer to run with KTM manual guidance, then use Loctite. I'm going to recommend you use Loctite because that's the factory settings. And that will be a red Loctite 204. And these go to 30 Newton meters. Now we can carry on, just clean everything up and put it back in. So clean your brake pads up. Get them a good brush off. You should wear gloves for this. I use barrier cream because my hands don't like gloves. If we've got this right, these will all go in. Don't push them in too far. Spring needs to be clean as well. just hooks in there. It's all held in by the pin, so it probably won't want to sit too happily without it. Here you can see that the pin is starting to corrode, and this is the problem. As soon as that corrosion starts, it's got through the plating on the pin, and this is just going to get rusty and get worse. Well, I guess we're going to have to try and actually keep this from corroding even more. I'm going to put some grease on the threads. What we don't want is any grease migrating onto the pads themselves. So now we need to just hook those pads back out a bit. Top of that spring is an arrowhead. It goes in the direction of travel, which means it points upwards. I'll get my fingers out of the way so you can see what I'm doing. Just move these around. There we go, until the pin goes in. Just snug that. And finally, this clip, there's a groove in the pin. That goes in there, and aside from wiping it, that's it. That's the caliper fully serviced. This is just a routine strip and clean, which you should do on a fairly regular basis. Don't go overboard on it, but just keep it all done so it's clean. Having put the caliper back together, what we now have is the pistons back in the caliper. The brake pads can be some way off the actual brake disc, which will bite you in the arse if you now ride off down the road, because when you try and pull the brakes, what will often happen is nothing. So at this point, what we do is we gently squeeze the brake lever and gently let it go. See, that's come all the way back to the bars with no pressure at all, because I pushed the pistons back. You need to push those pistons back out again. And there we go, that's all it took. So now I've got full brake pressure. Now the reason you do this gently is because the top of the reservoir is open, and if you pull that in hard and let go, the return pressure kicks fluid back into the reservoir, and you'll get a little spray up from the hole in the bottom of the reservoir where it leads into the brake pipe. And then that can come down all over your paintwork. Now you should, as I say, have cloths and such under here to prevent any accidental spills. Now's the point you check the level. Now, as I say, my bike isn't as level as it should be because I've got it set up for filming. With new brake pads, you should now top this up to within 5mm of the top. But I would say there's a cast line in there. I would use that as a guide. My level is okay because I've got part worn pads. I do not want to fill this up more than it is, because when the pads go back out again, when I'm working on the calipers, it will force its way back and it will overflood the reservoir. So we just put it back together. That line that's on there, you look how thick that is. If you filled this up more than over that line, when you push this in, it will force fluid out down and around the caliper. As the fluid level goes down, it sucks this rubber cover out. It extends down into the caliper. Just making sure the writing is facing the way I want it to write. to face. And you may be able to see just on the ends of the threads there is white corrosion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little bit of grease on the ends of those threads so that there's some protection, and you can see it in the top here. There's white alloy corrosion. So I'm going to put some grease on these. It never comes in contact with the brake fluids. There's no issue of contamination. And that will stop that from seizing in there. Because what happens with these is they seize in, you chew the heads out trying to get them out, and then you're stuck trying to get that out. And you end up having to drill the heads off and all sorts of rubbish just because that is stuck. It's only a small screw. Don't whack these in because you'll just end up compressing the gasket inside. I'm only using two finger pressure on these. Yeah, more than tight enough. That's all there is to a quick overhaul of your front brake caliper. How to take it apart, how to take the brake pads out, how to put new brake pads in, how to push the pistons back so that you can get the new pads in, and then to pump it back up again from the front brake lever so that it all works. It's something that you should do as part of your routine maintenance. Really depends how often you ride and in what conditions you ride. Certainly if I'm riding this bike in the winter, or any of my bikes in the winter here in the UK, when there's a lot of silt on the road, then I'll do it much more regularly. And it really does only take a few minutes, especially if all you're doing is pulling the pads out, giving it a quick clean. If you've got to find yourself a sort of bottle type brush, it'll just get in there. You can just give it a good wipe out, occasionally take it off, shove the pads back in, put the pin back in, and because you're doing it regularly, you're keeping everything clean, you're cleaning off the corrosion, you're stopping the things that will make your brakes go bad from happening. It's an easy job, no reason why you can't be doing it on your own bike. So I will see you soon.